everyone. Ariel Adams here with the Superlative Podcast. Please listen to our other aBlogtoWatch podcast, aBlogtoWatch Weekly, where we talk about the latest watch news and reviews. Today on Superlative, my guest is a longtime colleague and friend, Barry Cheung. He's the managing partner of Classic Watch Repair, and on Instagram, he's known as Bear Wrist. Barry, welcome.
Hey, Ariel. Good to catch up again. It's been a while, man.
So why don't you remind me when you first reached out, where you were living, what you were doing, how old were you? It's about almost a decade ago, right?
I think it's more than a decade ago. I actually first reached out when I was doing a research on my first watch. I stumbled across your lovely blog. I was doing a research on, actually, I still remember the timepiece. It's a Hamilton Khaki. So I think you're one of the first ones who I stumbled across doing video reviews with a lot of information, a lot of passion, that actually got me into the hobby. So I reached out back then, but I wasn't in the watch industry. I was still in university. So I think when we actually started working together, that was back in 2014. So you're right, slightly more than a decade ago when we really started working together. That was at the times when I was doing Undone.
Yes, Undone. And that has, the brand continues to exist today. Just for those who aren't aware of the complicated history of Undone, founded in Hong Kong. I'll let Barry discuss more of the details of who. Then it was sold, and now it's continued to be run by one of the original co-founders in Japan, actually. But you were starting out, how did you get connected with the folks at Undone, and what was the brand trying to be?
So back then I was a fresh graduate. And when I got back to Hong Kong, I met Michael Young. He's one of the co-founders of Undone. We met at his watch repair shop. That's Classic Watch Repair.
Where you work now?
Where I work now. So I've got some timepieces that I want to fix. But most importantly, I want to customize, explore the degree that how I can customize my own watches that I don't wear
so this
anymore
was back then. Back then,
that was back then.
You found this guy, and he did a variety of things. He did watch repairs, some modification, sort of this. And again, Michael, I think Michael's actually been on this show a while ago.
Oh yeah, true.
He's a fascinating guy, but again, just trying to, because businesses like him really don't exist in other places. He has a very unique approach. And so it's difficult. You can't just call him a watchmaker. You can't call him a restorer. You can't call him a repairer. He's more like a modeler. And it's a little bit complicated to understand how that works out.
You put it exactly right. I don't think there's a phrase or a term that you can describe someone like Michael. I think he's the executioner. He is the executioner, right? He's down to earth. He got ideas, like people around him got ideas, but he's the one who actually grabs all of them.
Yeah, but that also means the guy that kills people.
Not really. He's kind of a nice guy. I have to give him credit.
Oh, I know, but executioner, I'm just saying.
Kills ideas mostly, yeah.
So, okay, so you found him. And how did it go from, hey, I need you to maybe like fix and modify some watches to we're starting a brand, a very ambitious brand?
So when I first met him at his shop, I asked him to actually explore into customizing my Tissot watch, PRC200. It was a quartz chronograph.
I remember those. Yeah.
At a price range that is similar to what Undone was offering. Around $500-600 US. So instead of giving me a solution or asking me to customize, that timepiece, he asked me whether I wanted to join a startup that he's been already prepping 1 year ago. Before I met him.
So he had this thing planned, and he actually just invited you into it.
Yeah, it's actually it was meant to be a joint venture with one of his partnering brands. It used to be a service center for multiple brands. I don't want to name the brand, but
I see.
But it was originally meant to be a joint venture, but then the brand pulled out, so he decided to pursue it himself and renamed it and everything. It was a platform that was built. It was the first, back then, it was really the first customizable brand where we offer online customization in front of people where you get to play with the customizer so that there's real-time interaction. It sounds quite normal these days, but back in 2013, 2014, no such thing existed. Like if there was, it's merely like JPEG switching around.
I'll tell you what, I have seen watch customization platforms in very early form since the early 2000s. I remember when some of them were built in Flash and they were like barely usable. And you wondered, you're like, is this someone going to make this thing? And for so many times throughout even my short, history, about 25 years now being into watches, I've seen this come and go a lot. And it's difficult because it begins with this good idea. Like, how cool is it that for a relatively low price with an online interface, someone can customize something, I can build it, they can have something kind of unique, but it's not like crazy expensive because it's essentially modular. Yet it's a very difficult thing to do remotely. If people aren't playing with it or touching it, it's very difficult to get them to commit to something, right?
True, yes. So I think a slick interface, good programming skills. I'm not a programmer myself, but you got to be using a right platform so people have that actual experience instead of like crazy delays or something that doesn't look real. So it's actually a lot of stuff put together. You need to have good photos first. You need a good studio in order to project the right parts that's put together in front of you with millions of combinations.
It's a difficult thing to do. And then, Undone, I think, began very heavily in the customization thing and then started to adopt more, we'll call them stock models or core collection, ongoing things. Because what I've noticed is that people who are in the watch industry tend to be very advanced level collectors. And advanced level collectors have confidence to do things like design their own watch. But most buyers out there are not that advanced level. And so what you see is people making companies for people like them, even though they represent such a small slice of the market. And I firmly believe that most people that like watches out there are too intimidated by the fact that they're not an artist, they don't know enough. What if they make an ugly watch? What if they want someone to hold their hand? I still think that 90% of people ultimately either want to buy something that someone else created or want someone to hold their hand through like every step of the personalization process.
I totally agree with you, Ariel. Like if there's no framework, if there isn't a canvas that's already sort of prepped, it's very difficult to just navigate yourself by yourself to create something. That's the first factor. And also, if you start to go out on imaginations, then there's actual production limitations where we have to also take care. So whatever a brand is offering online, I'm talking about customization brands, they need to be well thought of so that there's enough room for and flexibility for imagination, but that's built on a solid product that people can actually enjoy and wear for years to come.
And again, I think it's important to say is Undone was built around the idea that its products could be customized, but didn't have to be. And so what it ended up being, which I liked, is you could buy plenty of stock products and then use them as a base to build on top of, whether you wanted to change colors or you actually wanted to have your own dial or case back printed or things like that. I love the idea of it. I just always knew that from an education standpoint, it would be a lot of effort to get people even accustomed to this idea, because even myself, who's done this a lot, if I haven't seen a watch before, I'm like, I don't know what the colors really look like. Like the people who actually deal with the watches, they're the ones that know better. And it's difficult to make that a portable experience that you sort of send around the world, right?
Yeah. It's not easy. And you really need a few base models as well, because one shoe doesn't fit all, right? You need multiple in order to attract people who to get their interest into the product and then start customizing. I think that's always the difficult part.
Now, here's an interesting thing. And again, I want to talk about this customization market because I think it's interesting, but very niche, and not a lot of people really are familiar with it. And There is a slice of the watch collector market. I'm not an expert in it, though I've seen it, which is watch modifiers. And what people mostly do is they don't start with a brand which is designed for modification. They'll buy, I think a Seiko is a classic example, also a lot of Citizens, frankly, mostly Japanese watches. And they will use those relatively inexpensive watches as a base and then take it to a specialist normally who can perform any number of modifications that can be quite intense, to making looking unrecognizable from the original and just using the same movement, or changing hands, dials, painting it different ways. Is this robust market out there for people that do customization. But I think the difference is people begin with something popular and say, I'll make my own version out of it, as opposed to saying what I want to do from the beginning is have something that looks like what no one else has, right? Like the psychology is a little bit different, right?
It's very different. You're right. I think the main reason you mentioned mostly Japanese brands, it's simply because it's more accessible. You can do trial and errors. It doesn't harm you too much in terms of your budget. You can play around with different dials, and also with Japanese movements and cases, you sort of know their sizes, and it's more popular. You can mass produce parts, so that I think I'd say 80 to 90% of the market that you mentioned are simply parts buying from platforms like eBay or even Taobao from China, because there are so many dial factories with extra capacity. People have to understand how a factory works, right? Like you won't produce one dial, you won't produce 10 dials. If you produce a batch, it's at least, from a factory's point of view, maybe 100 or even 500. And then it's how many they give you, how many you need. Minimum. Because when you have to when there's a production line, there's wastage, right? You can't just do one. It's in batches always. So there's so many leftovers where you can now just buy online at dirt cheap prices, like that you won't even be able to imagine. So I think that's how that market started, and that basically eventually it would be very accessible to basically anyone.
And price wise, you could go and get a modified Seiko base watch plus modifications for a few $100s. Sometimes you send them a watch and the service costs a few $100s. I've never heard of anyone spending more than $1,000 or $2,000 on some of these, modified Seikos and things like that. Again, mechanical watches with sometimes very interesting stuff. Some of them made to look like a Rolex or some other watch like that. I mean, people get really crazy with it. And there's a lot of, I think, support on that end of the spectrum. But then what I think emerged from that was something very controversial, which was the modification of higher end watches like Rolex in particular. And a lot less fandom, right, around that. Not only has Rolex clamped down from a legal perspective as much as they could on that, but people tend to look at it very harshly, like, oh, you modified a Rolex? Why would you wear that? So modified Seiko? Oh, cool. Modified Rolex? What are you doing? And really the only difference is price point and maybe sort of the brand image. But you'll agree that it only seems to work within a sort of narrow element of the category, especially at more entry level prices. The more expensive you get, the more weird people get about aftermarket modifications.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the main issue over there is the retention of value. When you get a Rolex, I'm talking about mainly the mass market, normal people who live a normal paycheck, who has not inherited like huge wealth. When you get a Rolex, when you buy an expensive watch, part of it would be an investment, right? You always want to be able to retain value, hoping that it might go up, things like that. But if you start modifying your Rolex, for example, the value instantly drops because it's not something that's been offered in the market anymore. If you sell it, there's no price anchor. Not many people would want to wear or want to own something that depreciates in value. But part of the market is, of course, the top 1%. And I think that's how the Rolex modification market started, where those people simply, they don't care. I think it's an attitude that they're wearing. So for those people, they might own yachts. That's at least what I know from some brands that I looked into for Rolex customization.
Oh yeah.
It's first started. They first started selling in yachts, right? Like it's a lifestyle. It's attitude that they don't care about resale value, that they want something different, but people know that it's expensive and they just do stuff to it.
When I've spoken to the people that are customers, they're honestly buying for the same reason that someone would modify Seiko. But as you said, they're much less price sensitive. So it's a very similar experience. Like, oh, this is just a basic thing, but like, wouldn't it be funny if it had these different hands, or it was all black or a different color? So for them, the mentality is very similar. But as you said, they're just a lot less price sensitive, because at a few $100, a lot more people can take that risk, completely lose all that money, not be a big deal. With the modified Rolex, you're talking about the base price of the Rolex, let's say $10,000 to $15,000 plus a several more $1,000s. So let's say, I remember Bamford, for example, would basically double the price. If it was like a $10,000, Rolex, it would end up being $20,000. So you're buying, more expensive. And then you're right. If you wanted to resell it, it'd be difficult. But you know what I heard recently? And this is kind of funny. You're absolutely right that the resale for modified Rolexes used to be terrible because essentially avoided the warranty. There wasn't really a big market for it, all kinds of issues like that. But since Rolex has started to clamp down legally on a lot of the modifiers, apparently the ones that are already out in the market are now going for a premium because people realize that it was sort of a time and a place, and not a lot of these high quality modifications are going to be created in the future. It's going to mostly be underground, and stuff like that. So actually, from an artistic and collector standpoint, I think that these, I don't know how many there are out there, probably several thousand of these high quality, modified Rolexes that were sold legally now are going to be collector's items. Is that kind of surprising to you?
Yeah, I really didn't know. I didn't follow the market. But if you talk about the art market, again, it's the top 1% or even top 0.1%. I'm sure those people see Rolex. Rolex is a tool watch. It's a Swiss equivalent of Seiko. That's when we are, we're repairing a lot of Rolex, right? We know that it's a tool watch. It's nothing more than that. So to those people,
it's mass produced. It's not supposed to be like one watchmaker polishing, bridges for hours on end.
There's always an inflation in the West compared to the East, right? So if you take that into account, it's pretty much that. It's like Rolex is in terms of the luxury watch market. They are also sort of, won't say affordable, but they're entry level compared to a lot of higher end watches, right? They are practical. Yeah. The positioning is different. So it depends on who is viewing at it and who is looking at. If you're looking at the overall picture, then you'd find that it's actually very similar to the Seiko situation.
I mean, look, that's a deeper topic. Some ways I agree with you. Some ways I think there's a lot of differences between the brands. But I think what you're talking about in terms of the way the watches are built and the production levels and things like that, you're absolutely right. Obviously, from a brand image perspective, there's vast differences. Before we talk more about Rolex, I want to talk about the sort of modification market a little bit more, because I want to draw parallels. And me growing up here in Los Angeles, I did not see a lot of modified watches, right? It wasn't something that I really noticed until I started traveling. I think I first noticed that a lot of the like customized Casios and Seikos were coming from Malaysia. And I was like, wow, why Malaysia? It seemed like such a far off and exotic place to me. But what we did have in Los Angeles was a lot of modified cars, especially Japanese cars, right? And so you didn't have as much people buying the expensive, let's say, German and Italian cars and modifying it, though there is some of that. But you had a lot, especially growing up, you had a lot of the Japanese cars that would be modified. And people would get, Hondas and Toyotas and Mazdas, honestly, especially Hondas and Toyotas, and soup them up, whether it was performance or just the way it looked cosmetically. But and again, I think in Hong Kong, maybe you had some of it, but less, because obviously it's less places to park a car, even though there's plenty around there. Would you agree that's sort of similar, that sort of modified Japanese car market to the modified Japanese watch market? They're very similar in ways, right?
They're very similar in a way, in a sense that I think if you modify a Western brand, a Western make, even in Hong Kong, if you drive like a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, less people want to touch it. They want it to be original. Like, of course, there are some exceptions, but mostly they want everything original factory spec. That might be again due to the resale value. That's my sort of guess. While for Japanese makers, people just go crazy about it. There's no limits. The more you customize it, the cooler it gets. It's more about performance and aesthetics. So you're right.
But it's weird because you could still improve the performance of those German or Italian cars in a lot of the same ways, yet the mentality is totally different. It's so open-minded on the Japanese side.
It's limited also by the availability of parts. Because if you think from a business point of view, people who are making those parts, they want to make sure they get returns on their investment, right? There are way more Japanese cars because I think it's due to price point, targeting more the mass consumers versus high-end, Western maker. I think there's less parts. Like Mercedes might have more parts. I see more people modifying Mercedes compared to Ferraris, for example, for sure. But I think in terms of sales volume, Nissan sells way more than Mercedes, for example, in terms of...
I hear what you're saying. I think it actually goes back to, now that I'm thinking about the idea of aspiration. Whereas if you buy, as you say, a stock Nissan, that itself does not look like you made it. But if you bought like a Mercedes, that looks like you made it. But if you buy a Nissan and you modify it to look different or to perform differently, that can, maybe it's cheaper in a lot of instances, give you the same feeling of aspiration. So I think that it's that emotional need that they're going for, and it's sort of like redundant to like buy the expensive car and then modify it, right? It's like double. Yes, and again, at the very high level, that's what people do. But I really think it goes back to less about do I enjoy driving this and more about what does this thing say about me to others.
True, and there's also a factor about the media. Fast and Furious plays a big role for sure.
Did they not modify German cars in there?
I
honestly, I think I only saw the first film.
I'm not a big car guy, but like honestly, I see much more Japanese cars in there, and Tokyo Drift, like movies like that creates that mindset where there's a fantasy about these Oriental like culture, things like that, where people just go for it. I think there's less boundaries if it's something that's from abroad.
Yeah, but honestly, I think the most vivid and prolific watch modification culture is probably in America of American cars.
Oh yeah.
By volume and by like wildness, those are some of the most crazy modifications. The Japanese stuff is pretty standard by comparison.
Yeah, I see cars jumping around in America.
Oh, of course, the hydraulics, the lowriders and stuff like that. Yeah. So I just wanted to talk about the car as a parallel, because I think for a lot of watch collectors who didn't grow up with a culture of watch modification, it can seem kind of weird. And I can understand that because there's so many available watches out there to buy. It's very rare where you're like, oh, well, if something I want isn't available, I have to go ahead and make it. And a lot of times, unless someone's gone through the process and actually seen the results, it's difficult to develop a fantasy about modifying your own watch and things like that. And then again, it's in Hong Kong, were you seeing other people doing it? Was it something you were only seeing online, or did you get to actually visualize other people wearing modified watches?
I think the trend of like, if you want to actually modify or customize a watch, I can definitely see that more and more people are going wild on their imagination to actually create their watch. So that's sort of outside of customization already. So in a sense, yes, there are more new brands coming in. I see a lot of even friends around me. They want to start their own brand with 3D printing, with CAD printing. A lot of ideas can be tested before going into actual production compared to 10 years ago. So yes, there are more and more people who want to try out their ideas to sort of customize their own watch, but they also give it a name at the same time. Or whatever they print on, there's always something to symbolize themselves, right?
Yeah,
They
it
might
used to be less about branding. Now it's more about brand. But I mean, back, more than a decade ago when you were getting into this, did you actually get to see other people that were wearing these? Did you have any hands-on experience with these modified watches before you decided to get one yourself?
Not really. No, it's not as popular. Not really. I've seen, of course, Bamford doing that. Because they do a lot of marketing and stuff like that. But besides them, I don't see, other brands doing it. And there's one company, I forgot the name. They build kits now. Companies comes with the kits where you can put together, you can actually assemble your own watch.
Yeah,
also.
There's a few of those brands now.
There's a few of those brands out there, right?
Yeah.
So those are becoming more and more popular in the past 5 years or so.
They're fun. I never know how popular they are, but they can be fun. Let's talk about Rolex. So you grew up in Hong Kong, right?
Yeah.
So I think that it's important to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you grow up in Hong Kong, watches are necessarily a thing because you see or you saw the signs and the stores everywhere. Like I guess what I'm saying is it's impossible to escape watches when you grow up in Hong Kong, right?
Yes, that's fact. It's difficult. It's just everywhere.
And is it something that young people are interested in? Do they want? Are they curious about it? What is the communication from people who are older and like watches to younger people about how to incorporate this into your adult life?
Well, my parents didn't like watches too much, so I might not be the best person to talk to, but people around me.
Well, I mean, did they actually warn you, or they just didn't care?
They didn't care.
Okay, but that's average. That's like most people's parents. It's it's one thing to not care. It's another thing like, Barry, you better watch out for those Rolexes. They're gonna get you one day.
They didn't warn me either, but I think you're absolutely right. Hong Kong used to be an entrepot. It's the main entrance to get into China, and as a British colony, when the economy picks up, there's a lot of Western brands, not just watches, but even car brands. Like people want to come into this market and to get a piece of it, right? So watches definitely was everywhere, and starting from the 80s.
Do teenage boys of your generation, did they all know the big brands? Like, because you're around it, could they rattle off all the big watch brands the same way that like a teenage boy can mention like supercars?
I think in Hong Kong, when I grew up, yes. Because when you go out, when you walk around, you just see all these expensive watches out there as a teenage boy in high school. And we always wonder, like, wow, what are these? But they tell the same time, but how can price be so different? Under these circumstances, you start to get curious at a very early age, compared to places where it's less accessible, for sure. And you get also a lot of media feeding the consumers. Like there are local medias that does advertising with local celebrities, etc. Think of Frank Mueller back then in the early 2000s, and then Panerai. These are brands that caused a huge hype, and now I see them dying down just simply because of local marketing. And depending on the age of the parent, some people are still stuck in those eras where that's the only brand that they would ever buy, that they would ever collect, and they would never sell. There's a lot of these segmented fan market in Hong Kong, for sure.
Now, did everybody have a watch, or was it similar to the West where most people didn't have a watch, but if you did have a watch, it was a luxury watch? Or was it more traditional where everybody was wearing something on the wrist, even if it wasn't high end?
I think in my generation, a lot of my friends, they already inherit a watch from their parent, because the parents of our generation worked hard, so they get themselves a watch besides to reward themselves, it's to pass on, right? So it's common for our generation to get inherit at least a Rolex, or some more lucky ones, Patek Philippe. I noticed the email newsletter. I read all of it about Patek. But yes, people like parents like to get Patek Philippe's for their kids to inherit. So I've got friends since I started doing classic watch repair back 2 years ago. They brought out Calatravas. That's quite common. Calatravas to service. They don't necessarily wear it, but at some point when they want to, especially when you have to attend a lot of weddings and things like that, they need to take out a nice watch to wear. Then the watch stops ticking, and they have to, take it out to service and to repair. That's how I actually realized a lot of people around me actually got nice watches also. So you're absolutely right.
I have a question. I actually never really thought about this. Hong Kong, of course, was a place to sell many, many watches you can buy and sell and things like that. But was there a lot of watch repair? Obviously, Michael, classic watch repair. But was there a lot of watchmakers doing repair given the amount of watches in town? Or was it actually more difficult to get a watch fixed than to buy a new one?
Well, nowadays, there are more and more independent watchmakers who are offering repair services.
Okay,
simply
that's good.
because there in Hong Kong there's a lot of authorized service centers, right? There's Rolex, there's Swatch Group. They employ hundreds of watchmakers, but the thing is, these people they can only do certain things. Maybe
they're
limited
more like
to the
technical.
movement.
Calling them a watchmaker is being generous.
Agree with you. They can only do maybe even certain movements, certain brands, because they've been doing the whole repetitive process for the entire life. It's like an iPhone assembler, right? You don't get to put together the whole iPhone. It's only part of that. So there are people who can repair watches, but they're more individuals. And there are a few bigger service centers, but I won't say many.
So let's go back to that early era. You were, you're getting modified watches. You're interested in that. Was it because you were just young and couldn't afford the other stuff? Or were you just not as interested in the luxury things and the sort of more project style, modification watches? It was just more interesting to you at the time. I'm just curious, what were you ultimately aiming for? Where were your aspirations at the time?
I think it's both. When you start off young, you don't have a lot of disposable income. And when you can purchase multiple watches versus one watch, I always go for multiple as a watch lover. You can enjoy wearing different complications, enjoy different brands, over buying one serious purchase. So I it's always more about the passion to try out something, and then if I already own something that I don't wear anymore, and if I sell it, it won't fetch me any returns, or the price might halve, then I'd rather customize it and see what I can do with it, other than let it sit in my cupboard, in my drawer.
So how when you started working in the watch industry, you were at Undone, you were working with Michael, did that increase your interest in modified watches? Or you're like, wait a minute, I'm an insider now, I have access to more stock things, I'll just get those. I'm just curious how that psychology developed as you got more and more opportunities to get a larger variety of things at fairer prices.
Initially, we're talking about Undone here, so I modified one or two Seikos, and that's it. We don't get much better prices than what everyone else did in terms of modifying Seikos. But yes, when we started doing our own brand, we know the cost structure of everything. I started initially, of course, I was more curious. I tried to explore more ideas, what we can actually launch in terms of material, in terms of design, colorways, just to fulfill my own satisfaction from customizing. But after a while, you know it's the same thing, and you can only customize it so many times that I started to get bored a little bit,
right,
to be honest.
Yeah.
It's the same base model, but you can only change the dial and hands. So ultimately, you want to launch more canvas. So you want to launch more models back. When I was doing Undone, I wanted to launch more different designs. So before I left, we actually stepped into almost getting our own movement made. That's the right before I leave, but we did not put a trigger. But we're almost there.
Ace Jewelers of Amsterdam and German watchmaker Nomos are back with another exclusive set of 50 pieces to help celebrate the 50th anniversary of the popular and dynamic retailer of Horology. This is not the duo's first successful collaboration, with these new exclusive products being their 8th and 9th limited edition watches respectively. This time, Ace Jewelers and Nomos focus on 2 sizes in the Metro Neomatic collection, each with a distinct palette of Dutch aristocratic orange colors. For centuries, orange has signified some of the core values of Holland, including personal freedom, tolerance, pride, and overall good cheer. 2 distinct multicolor orange dials were created by the renowned designer Mark Braun for these new limited edition Metro Neomatic 35mm and Metro Neomatic 39mm models. Both of the watches contain Nomos' celebrated in-house made automatic caliber DUW 3001 mechanical movement, which are visible through the rear of the steel Metro Neomatic cases. Stylish and full of value, these are fine timepieces with a fun regional flair that can appeal to enthusiasts everywhere. With included free worldwide shipping, price for the Ace Jewelers and Nomos Metro Neomatic 50th anniversary limited edition watches start at €2,810, excluding taxes. Learn more at acejewelers.com.
Talk about your time at Undone. What are some of the things that you're proud of accomplishing? What are some of the hard things? What did you learn about how people like to buy watches? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things you learn from there, but I think a lot of people saw Undone from the consumer perspective. Talk a little bit about behind the scenes, and again, some of the things you learned that you never would have guessed that you would have learned.
Back then, I learned so much about the importance of investors and capital when you're doing a brand like Undone. You can't just sell 20 pieces or 50 or 100 per month to survive, in such a with such a big team and investment. We have almost 40 or even 50 people at peak, or maybe even more than that, across 3 countries. There are parts already made, and each of them you're talking about maybe 500 pieces MOQ for one colorway. And we offered only bezels, maybe 7 to 8. So the investment was quite substantial. And without investors, without an actual marketing calendar, things won't work out because they won't just come naturally. Versus someone who just does it out of passion. I'd like to name Ming Watch, for example. I think Ming is a very cool brand where the founder just does it out of his own passion. Of course, I'm sure he is busy, but he takes his pace to design and to develop things until he finds that it's all right to launch. Versus at Undone, it was a mandate to push out, no matter if it's emails or if it's social media content or videos, it's a mandate. If there are no eyeballs, then there's no conversion. That's how the whole funnel is set up. So the most important thing that I've learned from Undone is capital and the conversion funnel, where you have to constantly feed the whole thing with different contents, collaborations, in order for it to work, which has its good and bad,
I want you to respond to something that's, I think, very important, because I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you just said. A lot of people in this industry have this fantasy that if they make a beautiful watch, people will discover it. And once they see how amazing it is, they'll just refer it and it'll get all this, organic traction. And they feel like, oh, I'm going to look embarrassing if I advertise and try to get eyeballs. And I've tried to tell these people that they're living in a fantasy world and that if that's their strategy, it's going to take them like 3 generations before enough people learn about it. Marketing is about speeding up how often people hear about you and how quickly they can become educated about you. I want you to say some words to those people who are those entrepreneurs, maybe have some great ideas, maybe have built some great watches, but have this weird emotional barrier against marketing and advertising. Give them a bit of wisdom.
I think at the right moment, when the product is ready, when it ticks all the boxes, it's really time to put on that booster to let people know about it. I think most people make the mistake because the minimum viable product is not even ready and they rushed out to do marketing. I think always ask yourself this question, whether the product is ready and whether you are really satisfied with it. I think most people would say they might always be 90% satisfied, but there's no perfect product that exists. But if you reach a certain point, like even 90%, when you got to sell, if there's no marketing, there won't be any traction because there's so much noise out there in the market. There are so many people doing the same thing as what you're doing. So you always have to be ahead of everyone to actually push the product out there. And there are so many means to do that. Advertising is a very broad term, but without any of these, it simply won't work. There's always a saying, when you cook in a house, you always need people to smell the food so that they can
I like that.
come in, right? Even if they can smell, you need, maybe you're in a village there's only like 10 houses around you. That's not enough. So without any good reviews to bring people near your house, then it's difficult for people to even know that you're cooking. I think watches, new watch brands are also like this concept of trying new things. And as we know, most people are creatures of habit. So if you don't tell them that they need to be curious, most people simply aren't. Like, I'm someone that just likes to discover things. I'm naturally curious because I'm neurotic and I understand that I'm a minority. Maybe you're also naturally curious. But again, we agree that most consumers are just like, I have a need today. What do I know about satisfying that need? I'm going to go to that familiar thing. I'm going to do a habit. I'm going to go to a routine. Whereas in order to get them to try something new, you have to, I used to call it flirting with them, but the idea of like having to smell a meal cooking, I think that's a wonderful analogy. You have to get them curious that there's something that they might be interested in. Otherwise, they're not curious. Most people, they don't want to be curious. It's actually annoying. It creates cognitive dissonance to be curious about something. People like feeling like they know enough. You know what I mean? Yes, that's very true. And also we must mention about the algorithms nowadays behind social media. The algorithm, I think that would be the most natural talk because most people spend the time on social media. Whatever the feed is, there's only so limited places where you can see placements and ads. And the algorithm would already know whether your product could be liked or not. And having advertisement or just backlinks and things like that already helps a lot, because most brands don't have these. Talking about new brands, when they have no idea, when they just started off, they don't have any of these. So you have to start ticking these boxes to actually tell the system, the algorithm. And that's the only way to tell them that you actually
I'll say this
present.
About the quote-unquote algorithm. Of course, there's many of them, but algorithms, as they're designed, and I don't think it's going to change, are essentially what I call reinforcement engines. They're not really there to help you discover anything new. They're there to replicate what they found as success. So if something has been successfully marketed and works, it will just replicate that. It's not going to say, you know what, no one knows about this stuff, let me sample it. algorithms do not sample and any type of stuff like that for the most part. They just reinforce what already has been determined to work, which is, again, a feedback loop, which does not allow for creativity, originality, which is what people want in products like luxury watches. So I've noticed something else that is very dangerous these days that actually directly contravenes the wisdom you said about making sure you have capital and stuff like that starting. Undone was one of those companies that started being ready to sell, meaning by the time people heard about it, you could reach out to the business, you could order any number of watches, you were set up to do business. But today, more and more, I see a very dangerous trend, which is, I call it the fake it till you make it brand. The people that are under like permanent Kickstarter, right? They spend several years trying to get enough money to make that first watch or those first few watches. They're running on a skeleton crew, if any. They have maybe sample watches, if anything. They are trying to gain backers who are basically just customers by pretending like it's exciting, by pretending there's a brand, by pretending there's a watch, when the reality is they're crowdsourcing investors. And the problem is that consumers are not investors. They have nothing to gain other than that product that they paid for. Investors stand to profit. Consumers stand to just get that thing that they wanted to buy. So I see this very dangerous trend of brands who are in some type of permanent fundraising cycle and for several years don't ever seem to actually become a brand. Many of them never will. But I think that it's ultimately deleterious to the experience of the consumer because people are being asked to pre-order or crowdsource or back projects where I think a company should not be able to go to a consumer for the most part until either they have something ready to sell them immediately or are very, very clear on when it will arrive.
I think in the traditional sense, yes, you're absolutely right, Ariel. But I think part of the situation was also caused by those who are backing it. I think back maybe also 10 years ago or 8 years ago, Kickstarter and Indiegogo were very popular, right? It was a marketplace where you discover ideas. So initially it was a hype. Even people who are buying on those platforms, they feel good about it because they discovered something new that they can sort of back this project at what's called a discounted price compared to what the normal retail price would be. But eventually it became just a channel where brands are just, sort of taking advantage of this time delay where they can collect the money first and then produce something for the customers maybe even a year later. That's not a cool experience.
And that's not good for consumers. That's so common right now. Like you said, time delay. And I tell people to watch out for that. We have a rule in aBlogtoWatch. If a company has a situation like that, we say you need to reach our audience through an ad. You have to basically explain that this is not a product that's ready to buy yet, that this is an advertisement and that there's no product. I think it's fair. And some people say, oh, well, we can't afford that yet. I'm like, well, then don't get it. Because if you don't even have the ability to spend a modest, tiny amount on marketing, can you make any of your consumers happy? Like that worries me. Like I have to create a boundary, a barrier, because as you know, we're very supportive of new brands, but I'm also a defender of the consumer. And I don't want to put people in too many situations where they're being recommended to give money to some fly-by-night organization that's never going to give them a watch. I want to make sure that companies that we editorialize about are companies that you can do business with right now and actually get a watch.
Yeah, they might even go away. Yes, of course. I've seen brands that actually fled. Founders, they raised capital, they never delivered, and they just went away. There are cases like that also. So
There's a lot of that.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. And usually when those brands reach out to you, Ariel, do they have a product ready for you to review, or do they have nothing at all? Just images and that's it?
There's a few situations. I'd say probably the most common are those that just have a few samples, right? And so people understand how this works is before you make a production run, you can often get samples, which is more expensive than individual watches you produce, but are essentially there for marketing purposes to show people the prototypes, essentially, the prototypes. And they will try to launch a brand just with prototypes. So what they'll try to do is get me to review a prototype as though that's the watch people are going to buy. And I say, no. Just because you have a sample doesn't mean you're ready to actually ship stuff to consumers, nor does this watch actually represent what people are guaranteed to get. You need to advertise. So they try to like squeeze it in, like to pretend like they're ready to go when they're not. Some of them are more open with the fact that they have nothing to send because, of course, they don't even have samples or prototypes, and I have to make it clear to them. But a lot of it is, me gatekeeping and explaining to brands that I don't think you're ready to go. I don't think you're ready for prime time. I want to make sure that people are happy when they make purchases. I fundamentally believe that if you don't get a watch or have a bad experience with a brand, that means that your hobby's not as fun. And remember, even though this is a business to the brands, I'm running a hobbyist publication. aBlogtoWatch is to support the hobby. Anything that's not fun for the hobby, I don't want to talk about. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Totally get you.
Dealing with a brand that makes you buy multiple watches before you can buy the watch you quote unquote want, that's a crappy hobby. I wouldn't want to tell people to go to that hobby, but going out there and buying a watch and discovering something where someone values your money and you feel good about yourself, that's a fun part of the hobby. So that's why that's sort of the way that I try to gatekeep is I say, okay, liking watches is recreation. It makes you happy. It brings people together. It's something fun to think about. It's fun to buy. It's a great diversion. Anything that makes that hobby less happy or less good or too expensive or unfair, I don't want to bring it up to you, or I want to protect you from it, or I want to at least warn you, stay away from stuff like that because you're going to see it advertised all over the place. Brands love places like Instagram because for the most part, there's no gatekeeping. As long as you pay money to advertise, you can say whatever the hell you want to say. You know what I mean?
Yes, I totally get you. But there are also bigger brands or even independent watchmakers nowadays. They're doing the same. They the subscription model where you have to pay in advance and wait for 2 years for the actual production to come out.
And I won't recommend that stuff.
Yeah,
as little as possible. Once in a while, I'll write it. Look, I want to make a distinction. If it's your first watch, I think it's more risk than you've made a bunch of watches before, right? If you have established track record in the market, you're an independent watchmaker who's already done stuff, you have a facility set up, I'd say it's less risk to back their subscription because, again, they're already an established player versus someone who's never done something before. So I am a little bit more lenient with someone who is a known commodity, which I think is fair.
Right. But the co-creation process, besides crowdfunding, the co-creation process can be something that the customers might be looking for. Some people really like that. I've heard
they do, yeah. But I think that it's people. It goes back to aspiration. They're like, oh, I'm getting in on this before it gets popular, or a few years from now, these are going to be a lot more expensive. I still think that there's a lot of interesting aspirational psychology which goes on. I think that most people that are confident, that have money to spend and aren't really worried about wasting it, they still prefer to buy watches which they can get right away.
True. Yeah, that's always the case. If you buy, you always want something to take away, as soon as possible. That's always the case. That's always the case.
So let's talk a little bit about the Hong Kong market today. There's obviously still an enormous amount of passionate people there who like watches. There's still a lot of watch stores. It's not the market that it used to be when I last visited you there. I don't think it ever will be again. But help people understand what's going on in the watch market in Hong Kong. How stable is it? Where do you think it's going to be in a little bit? Again, because it hasn't gone away. It's just not one of those top 3 or 4 places in the world for watches like it used to be.
Okay. Oh, I can't represent everyone, but from what I'm seeing, Hong Kong, I don't think it has changed that much, to be honest. If you talk about price dropping, that's a global phenomenon. Like from peak, especially during COVID, price rose a lot.
When you say price dropping, what does that mean?
When secondhand prices, like for Rolex, for example, has dropped from peak.
But that, for me, that's not price dropping. That's less inflation
Less inflation,
Yeah.
yes.
It's
Yeah,
not price reduction.
So it's not price reduction, but I'm talking about second-hand market here. So it's
People
not
are willing to get less margin. That's really all that means, right?
people can't sell if they don't drop. It's market, it's supply and demand. It's just market reaction. Because before, during COVID, people couldn't travel, and when they accumulated so much money and they're being fed with content online, they can spend time to read, to consume, and learn about watches. Plus the new money in investing in crypto, they have to spend, right? So I feel like during those years, money went into watches. It's it's a small item, easy to manage, to maintain, and to ship, and etc. So I think it's maybe people see it as a good store of value. So prices started to go up, and then there's this price correction when the borders are open again, and when people realize that they can also get other brands. So just in terms of Rolex from peak, I think on average it has dropped about 30% in some popular models, like
Good.
pre-owned Daytonas, etc. But the market is still vibrant. If you go into Rolex store, if you go into an AD, you still can't get anything. It's normal. Everything is just on display. I don't even know why they exist, man. Like when you go in, they don't even want to serve you too much. If you ask questions, they feel like you're wasting their time because there's nothing to sell. But they're standing there playing with their phones. That's very common in Hong Kong. But there are also watch fairs in Hong Kong where dealers gather, they trade watches. And I can see that those fairs are getting more popular with non-dealers. The boundaries are quite blurred now. If you're a very passionate collector, you buy multiple watches, then suddenly you became a dealer. If you just want to trade up your watches for better watches. So everyone sort of became a dealer.
Or a trader, so to say.
Traders, yes, so to say, but they all use Chronos 24. So everyone is just buying from everyone and selling to everyone. Yeah. I think that's a shift. That's a behavioral shift where these platforms has actually bridged C2C, consumer to consumer.
I think they're just doing what auction houses have been doing for a long time, where a lot of those people who are buying and selling, it's just the same group of people going through the auctions again and again and again, right? And now they just said, oh, screw the auction houses, we'll just do it direct.
True. Auction houses, they charge a premium, but there are already so many scandals, not even scandals, just bad news where
scandals. There's actual scandals.
There are scandals, but some might be accidents. There's always benefit of the doubt that if
you're people, a nice
guy. They're just not. A lot of people are just not knowledgeable to find out. They just care about the sale, the transaction, the profits, and that's it. So if no one is doing the due diligence, plus all these terms and conditions are all protective to the auction house, not to the consumer, they start to realize that they can actually go elsewhere to buy. So
now, you wanted to talk a little bit about the vintage market and the ups and downs there. People know I've never been that interested in the vintage market because I've always thought it's inflated. A lot of those watches are cool, but again, it's not really a practical thing to wear on a daily basis. You've seen ups and downs in the vintage market. Obviously, Undone was heavily inspired by the popularity of vintage watches. You weren't selling vintage watches, but the popularity of the styles was a huge influence on at least the first few model collections.
Yeah, I mean, when we were talking just now, a lot of collectors are even asking the same question, whether vintage watches will come back again. We're talking about mostly vintage Rolex, because Rolex is an interesting brand where it has long history. It has got good production volume. So there's actually a high demand for it globally. So if you look into their old stuff, when someone gets a new Rolex and when you can reference it back maybe 30 or 40 or even 50 years ago of the same model, but with different specifications or different details, I think that's where the beauty of collecting a vintage watch comes in, because you can start to compare and reference what are the advancements in terms of material, technology, etc. Of the same watch. And secondly, there is documentation of serial numbers, which not many brands have. And you sort of know the production year and the amount of watch that's available for certain models, especially for the older ones. There are maybe some of them are very limited, so there's scarcity compared to the new ones. So I think when these factors come in play, it becomes a very attractive proposition to some buyers who might want to get something that they want to keep or pass on to their next generation. But we're always talking about whether this market would eventually die down, because more and more people start off wearing an Apple Watch and they're not aspired to buy maybe even expensive timepieces anymore. Versus there's another school of thought where people think Apple Watches is actually an entry point of putting something on the wrist again. So what's next? If you own an Apple Watch and if you want something new, something nicer, then it might be a gateway to get into watches. So
and it often is. Now, how important is the popularity of the vintage watch market to classic watch repair? Meaning, are people having watches repaired in order to resell them, or are these the watches that they purchased and want to own and wear? Talk about how that market is directly linked to what you're doing at classic watch repair.
Okay, there are obviously different customers. Some of them want to restore, most of them, they want to restore timepieces that they inherited from the grandfather, from the father. It's more emotional, and they like these
sentimental
pieces,
restoration.
Sentimental restorations we do a lot. And not just on Rolex, even on Seikos. People spend money just to, they just basically want to retain how the watch looks.
Yeah, they're trying to keep like their dad or grandfather alive in the form of a watch, basically.
Exactly. And it's funny, if a watch couldn't keep time, if it doesn't tick, then there's no value. That's the soul of the watch, right? At Classic Watch Repair, our specialty is band restorations. Like, that's big part of our business.
The bracelet.
The bracelet, we call it, bracelet restoration, because the bracelet will get stretched out when you wear it so many times throughout the years. So a lot of
older watches, new ones not so much.
New ones not so much, but maybe watches that are 20 years, 30 years plus, especially back then when production and the material wasn't as good as nowadays.
Well, people, just explain, they used often folded pieces of metal, whereas today a lot of the bracelets are made of solid milled pieces. And so because a lot of the bracelets were hollow or folded, they had the tendency to stretch and bend and deform, whereas that's, again, a lot less possible today.
Well, it's still possible today. I mean, there's still pins inside the solid links. So if you wear it, if you wear it for over the years, it will still become stretched. But before, most people maybe just own one watch or two watches. But nowadays, when the society has become more affluent, you own multiple watches, you swap around. So the lifespan of a watch actually becomes much longer compared to your grandfather's generation, where they only wear one watch for recreation and to work. They just never take it off. So when you mentioned about the importance of vintage watches, besides inheriting, that when the market to buy vintage watches was much bigger, then people would like to at least restore the bracelet, because a lot of people like the watches unpolished. That's part of a lot of collectors' mindset is like that. They want to buy it in a good condition, but untouched. But for a bracelet, if it's stretched, it's stretched. That affects value of the watch also. So a lot of people, when they restore the watch, if it's not sentimental, then it's about value creation before they sell it. And we've got clients who are dealers, auction houses, like places like these people are refurbishing for better margins, basically.
Yeah, and that's important because I think that, the art world has always had this secret underbelly of restorers, because old art that's been in storage or in someone's home, not just paintings, but all types of art, often has damage. But people simply don't want to buy damaged art at auction. They like things to be in more or less perfect condition. And so that's where the restorers come into the rescue. And these people do everything from fix frames to fix cracks on sculptures. I think in the 1990s and 1980s to the early 2000s, a lot of today's most impressive watch makers were restorers. Michel Parmigiani, F.P. Journe, there's others. And these people worked for auction houses, and they essentially took these sometimes several hundred-year-old clocks that didn't work at all and said, we can't sell it in broken condition. You have to figure out a way of fixing it. And that was really, really crucial. A lot of the scandals, of course, come in with wristwatches that are said as, untouched pieces of history, and they're modified and pieces are swapped out. So it can get into a weird gray area, especially depending on how these are sold. But restorers are the backbone of the resale market for used objects of value because, again, nobody wants to buy anything that doesn't work.
Yes, and no one wants to buy something that doesn't look good. Like, it affects value for sure of how it's presented. You're absolutely right. And that's a good metaphor, actually, of, when you talk about people who fix frames, who does this and that. It's exactly the same thing. It's always about the condition.
Yeah. And being able to contact yourself, a place like Classic Watch Repair, and I think what makes them special is I don't think it'll cost you as much as if going to some of the other places to do it that don't specialize in this, because they're just there to do watch repair. This is a little bit more advanced. This is a sort of added layer on there. Barry, we're basically out of time, so we'll have to have you back on the show again. But before we go, remind people where they can find you on the internet and where they can learn more about Classic Watch Repair.
So if you want to find us on Instagram or Facebook, our handle is Classic Watch Repair. And we have a website. It's www.classicwatchrepair.com. So that's where you can discover our services and our latest price lists. And myself, I'm Bearwrist on Instagram, BEARWRIST. That's my handle. You can always reach me there for any quotations or any questions about watch restorations.
This has been the Superlative Podcast interview with the co-partner of Classic Watch Repair and Bearwrist, Barry Cheung. Barry, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Ariel. Have a good day.